Okay, so I think you guys all have heard me introduce myself a couple times now, but I am Shannon Sprigg with the NOAA Chesapeake Bay office. I co-chair the education work group of the Chesapeake Bay program and oversee the BWET program that Patty was just referring to. So if everybody wants to take a minute or so and introduce yourself in the chat, your name, state, your organization, anything else you want to throw in there, that would be fantastic. And while you are taking a moment to do that, I am going to take a moment to introduce our panelists for this morning's discussion. Well, first, my co-organizer, because I can't stop staring at myself when I'm there. My organizer is Christy Gabbard with Local Concepts. She has been our consultant working on all of our network development work, and you are really in for a treat when you hear all the great work that they have been, when she discusses all the great work they've been doing. And we have Jessica Kester, who is the president of the Pennsylvania Association of Environmental Educators. Tamara Peffer, who is with the Pennsylvania Department of Education as their Environment and Ecology Content Advisor, and also the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Advisory Council on Environmental Education. We have Judd Pittman, who is the Special Consultant to the Secretary of Education on STEM in Pennsylvania. Did I say that? And I also wanted to do a big shout out, a big thank you to our note taker, Debbie Her Cornwell from the Maryland Department of Planning. If anybody wants to follow along or add their observations, you can access, I'm going to pop these things into the chat here. You can access our notes document. The top link is to the notes document. The second link is to essentially the exact same thing, but in PDF form if you can't access Google Docs, but it'll allow you to follow along and kind of have the background information for this session. Okay, so why are we here? Why are we in this group? Thank you for joining us. I appreciate your, kind of interest in this session. So we're here to talk about the importance of networks in achieving our vision for every student in the region to have these meaningful watershed educational experiences, sustainable schools practices, and kind of in general, meaningful environmental literacy programming as part of their formal K through 12 instruction, right? So embedded into what they're doing. I want to highlight something that was said earlier by Secretary Dunn. We view systemic environmental literacy as a strategy that moves us towards equity, right? So those two things in our mind are connected to each other because all students are more likely to receive an experience if districts set the expectation that it's supposed to happen, right? It's supposed to happen, then the schools, then they do it for the most part, right? This is often accomplished by embedding it into the district curriculum, and that's what we've been encouraging for a number of years. So making it part of the curriculum, so it's kind of what tells the schools what they're supposed to be doing. And then the school district needs to provide that support, like teacher professional development, materials, funding, all those things that make these programs possible. The other thing to note, and Christy will get into this, is that states play the leading role in organizing and engaging with their school districts, and therefore much of the work that we do in the education work group is done with our state partners. That said, everyone is welcome as a part of our conversation, and as Christy will explain, we're actively looking for ways to intentionally grow and connect state networks and kind of these other groups. At the Bay program, so kind of the work that I do, we see our role as a catalyst and a funder for this effort primarily. So we're trying to catalyze and support the work that the states are doing. We're bringing the necessary resources to both define kind of what we're going to talk about today, and then support what this looks like. One thing I wanted to note is that through today's conversation, I'm going to pop something else in the chat. We will be using a Padlet to get your ideas. That is the Padlet. Everybody should have access to it. That's where we're going to kind of brainstorm and kind of lead us through our conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to Christy now to get us going.
Wonderful to be here with you all. Thank you so much, Shannon. And it's nice to see so many kind of familiar faces and some new ones. So again, my name's Christy Gabbard, and I'm joining you today from Southwest Virginia in the Appalachian Mountains. I'm the owner of Local Concepts, which is a network development consulting company. And I am joined by my business partner, Sonia Kiner, who is also calling in from Bowie, Maryland. So before we hear about all the good work that's happening in Pennsylvania, continue to hear about the good work that's been happening in Pennsylvania around environmental literacy, Shannon asked me to briefly share with you the results and recommendations from an assessment of the environmental literacy landscape that Local Concepts conducted over the last year. And some of you actually participated in this assessment. So a big thank you to all of you for your support and your feedback. It was extremely helpful. As many of you know, in support of the environmental literacy goal in the Chesapeake Bay Agreement, the Chesapeake Bay Program Education Work Group has a vision where all students graduate environmentally literate. And as Shannon just mentioned, this is a way to ensure equity in getting environmental literacy to students, is that all students graduate environmentally literate. And this is, think about that. It's a really big vision. It's a great vision to have. And last year, Local Concepts was hired to interview and connect with a variety of environmental education stakeholders from across the Chesapeake Bay watershed to determine whether an outdoor learning network was needed to drive change faster toward that vision of all students graduating environmentally literate. The focus for this assessment was on networks, because networks can be particularly useful for solving complex issues that no single organization can solve alone. Intentionally developed networks can be very effective at supporting decentralized collaborations, potentially collaborations between formal and non-formal educators from across a state. And they're also really great at supporting innovation and scaling impact. And the really cool thing about networks is that in order to be part of a network, your organization doesn't need to change its mission to reflect the mission of other organizations in a network. It simply means that you need to share common values and vision with others that are part of the network. And the reason why that's important is that vision, that common vision, the common values are the driving force for the network. And it's oftentimes that a network's vision is broad enough. It's broad enough that it brings together really more diverse perspectives because people can see where they have a role to play in the network with a broad vision. So it brings together diverse perspectives, and it allows more than the usual suspects to be at the table, which allows for really creating pathways for more innovative thinking and practices and partnerships. So because of the numerous benefits of networks, the Chesapeake Bay Program Education Work Group was interested in learning whether a new outdoor learning network was needed to advance the vision, again, where all students graduate environmentally literate. And what I'm going to do is just share with you briefly some of the results from the assessment, as well as some recommendations that we developed because of the work that we did over the last year through the assessment. And what the assessment process revealed is that there's quite a lot of work happening across the watershed to advance environmental literacy. And you've heard about that work happening in Pennsylvania today, and you all are each involved in this type of work in your own state. So we know that there's a lot of work happening to advance environmental literacy, and that there actually is a network of networks that already exists among the environmental literacy movement. So I'm going to share my screen. And just give me a second to pull this up. Okay. I'm going to share my screen just to show you a figure, which I think is helpful to see as I describe what we learned. And actually, on my screen, it looks like it's off. Can you all see?
Christy, we can see the conceptual model.
Do you see at the bottom where it says level 1 though?
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. So just wanted to make sure you could see it all. But okay, so again, thanks, Sonia. This figure is a conceptual model of the environmental literacy network of networks that exists. And it shows kind of the different levels and then how these levels may interact. And again, this is just a conceptual model, but to orient you to this model, on the bottom right-hand corner of the figure represents the work that's happening in school districts within a state. And moving clockwise, level 2 represents all the work happening at the state level to support formal educators and non-formal educators. So for example, the Science Teachers Associations and the state associations for environmental education. And then level 3, kind of on the top right, represents the formal and non-formal decision makers within each state and across the region. And during the assessment process, what we heard from stakeholders is that there are gaps that exist both within each level. So there are gaps that exist within level 1 and level 2, but there's also gaps that exist across levels. And so these gaps exist from kind of the school districts up to the decision maker. And by gaps, I mean connections to one another. And so these gaps that exist are effectively slowing the expansion and systemic integration of environmental education initiatives to date. So more needs to be done at level 1. Shoot, my slides aren't working. One second.
Christy, there's a button at the bottom that says show all too, because the bottom of it is cut off. I'm wondering if that button.
You know what? I'm going to just escape presentation. I'm so sorry. And let me just pull this back up again. Hey, Sonia.
Yep.
Maybe if you could pull up that presentation, it's in the summit folder, and then just share the screen in a second. Well, actually, I'll get it. But let me just talk to you about the levels. So in level 1, what we learned is that, again, level 1 is where the school districts are. And what we learned at level 1 is that we really need, that's where basically the work happens to scale the periphery, where you can reach under-resourced communities and bring new school districts into the fold. So that's happening kind of across states within the different school districts. And then we learned that more needs to be done to kind of reach out in that level 1 area to reach more of these under-resourced communities. We also learned that more needs to be done at level 2 to connect the existing formal and non-formal networks. So level 2, again, is the statewide networks, and more needs to be done at level 2 to connect the existing networks and organizations that are right now functioning to support formal educators and then separately to support non-formal educators. So more needs to happen to kind of bridge those two different groups and bring them together, because there's a lot of work that's happening within these two different entities that are serving the formals and the non-formals, but they're not well connected in many cases. There are some great examples that we're going to learn today where these connections are happening, but more could happen to sort of bridge those formal and non-formal educators. And then we also learned that more needs to happen at level 3, and level 3 is again kind of where we see the decision makers sitting. So more needs to happen at level 3 to scale up the work, to really influence those decision makers, to change policies, to change practices, to redirect resources, and ultimately change mindsets. So this is what we learned about what exists and where there are gaps and opportunities. And now I'm going to kind of briefly walk through some of the recommendations, and I'm going to try to do this without slides because we're too short on time for me to try to pull this up. But one of the things, there's a quote, and one of the quotes that we really like and that kind of centered our thinking when we developed our recommendations is a quote from David Fleming in his book called Surviving the Future. And that quote is, "Large-scale problems do not require large-scale solutions. They require small-scale solutions within a large-scale framework." And achieving the vision of all students graduating environmentally literate across multiple states is definitely a large-scale problem. And this requires changing a system, but it requires not just changing one system, it requires changing a system for each state. And it's really difficult to take on such a large, complex problem at scale. It can just be too massive. Change at that scale is too slow, and there's just too much room for potential conflict. Instead of kind of tackling this as a large scale problem, what's required is connecting to more diverse players on the periphery and supporting more nimble, small scale solutions at the local level. And we're calling, again, that local level, level 1. So supporting more small scale solutions at the local level, or in the case of environmental literacy, in the school districts. And then using the large scale framework to strategically and intentionally share the innovations happening at the local level to scale impact. So to achieve the vision where all students are graduating environmentally literate, we suggest the appropriate large scale framework is at the state level because, and Shannon mentioned this earlier, but that's where the standards of learning are set, and you all are very familiar with this. That's where graduation requirements are set. And it's really clear that without buy-in at the state level, local implementation is going to be difficult and scattershot and difficult to maintain. So our recommendations center the individual states, and they aim to build the capacity of the formal and non-formal educator networks that are operating at the state level to build their capacity to form a partnership to then reach down into level 1 and reach the priority school districts, and then reach up to level 3 to connect with the decision makers. So basically, I have this really great slide that walks you through this, but I think what's really important to note here is that there is the emphasis of our recommendations are on that state level, and really having state level, the existing state level networks and organizations form partnerships and build their capacity to work together. And we really see the network catalysts like the Chesapeake Bay Program Education Work Group, funders, NOAA, and other national and regional entities serving as catalysts for this work, providing professional development, building capacity for this partnership at the state level or at level 2, so that the partnership between the formals and non-formal education networks are strong. And then together they can look down, so to speak, to level 1 and support what we're calling network weavers, or you'll hear more today about the work Jessica Kester's doing through the Association for Environmental Educators in Pennsylvania, where they're looking and they're reaching out into the local communities and connecting those local communities to resources. So again, having sort of the network catalysts, the funders support the level 2 partnership between existing formal and non-formal educator networks to look down and together identify network weavers to reach out across the periphery in the states and reach those priority districts so that you can bring more of these priority districts into the fold, hear more about the innovative practices that are happening on the ground, and bring those innovative practices back up to level 2 where they can be distributed across the state through these existing partnerships of formal and non-formal networks. We also think that by strengthening the statewide networks of formal and non-formal educators, we can look up, thanks Sonia, we can look up to level 3 where the state decision makers are and begin to use network influencers to really influence the decision makers that are affecting the standards of learning and the graduation requirements for each state. And again, I can't say enough about how important it is for these network catalysts, those on the left-hand side of the screen, to continue to kind of support and resource the work of the statewide level 2 networks to look down, connect with the communities across each state, and then also look up to influence the decision makers. The really good news is that some of this work is happening. This type of work is happening. We're going to learn more about how this is playing out in Pennsylvania. And we know that more needs to be happen. And the good news is that the funders are supportive. They really want to catalyze this type of work happening in each state. So with the completion of the assessment, phase 1 of this work has just recently wrapped up, and phase 2 is just now getting underway. Phase 2 aims to support the development of those state level networks between the formal and non-formal educators. It aims to build their capacity. And this next month on July 15th is the first meeting in a series of meetings to begin to bridge, to identify who's out there and begin to bridge and strengthen the partnerships among these existing networks and organizations. If you're interested in learning more about this meeting or know others that are operating at that state level that should be at this meeting, please share your name in the chat box, and we'll be sure to get in touch with you after this summit. So we hope that these meetings are going to prepare the statewide networks. So we hope that the meetings that we'll be supporting over the next year as part of phase 2 of our work will prepare the statewide networks to collaborate. And there's an upcoming BWET grant that may be a perfect way for these networks to collaborate. It's a multi-year capacity building grant. It's going to be released this fall, and it's the perfect way for strengthening the partnerships between the formal and non-formal statewide networks, and also supporting phase 3 of this work, which is really where we begin to get where we are hoping to see network weavers kind of deployed throughout the different districts in the state, and also network influencers connecting with decision makers. So now I'm going to turn it over to the folks from Pennsylvania, where, as I've mentioned, these kind of recommendations are already underway. And as you listen, think about your state, how these lessons learned from PA, from Pennsylvania, could be adapted to fit your state's unique situation. Shannon mentioned there's a Padlet link that has questions that will serve as prompts for you that can be used in your state breakout later today. So with that, I'd like to introduce Tamara Peffer. Tamara is the Environment and Ecology Content Advisor and Executive Director on the PA Advisory Council on, and she's the Executive Director on the Pennsylvania Advisory Council on Environmental Education. And I think Tamara's going to kind of kick us off and describe the current state structure that supports environmental education in Pennsylvania and how this has shifted over recent years. And so with that, I'll turn it over to you, Tamara.
So, hi, everyone. Those of you who know me know that I've come to PDE in 2019 after a very long stint. You can do the math. I started in the environmental education world in '94, but it's been part of my family culture for eons, just in practice, but I've had professor and family members who have led environmental organizations at the state and NGO level. So anyway, in Pennsylvania, we have a very, very strong legacy of environmental education. And the person who held my position before me had left in 2012. And things were lining up, but when she left, each agency took responsibility for what they needed to do. And all the NGOs were doing their thing, but there wasn't a conductor leading all of the pieces of the orchestra. So when my position came back in place, and there are several people on this panel who have absolutely supported this restart of this position, what we started to do was look at where we had needs. Now, there was an existing capacity building grant, and the target of that grant was to make sure that we had an infrastructure of non-formal environmental educators, which Jess is going to talk about more in a little bit, who were ready to go when we dropped and said, it is time to roll out into the schools. So we have nearly 500 environmental educators across the state, and over, I think, 280 who are MWE ready. So that's a big piece. We also have the Interagency Cooperation. So my position is funded by PDE, DCNR, Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, which was my former home, Department of Environmental Protection, and Department of Agriculture. So right there, it requires that we have cooperation between the agencies. On top of that, we began working and rolling out to the schools. We have teams on our ELIT capacity building team from conservation districts, from higher ed, from industry, and on the Advisory Council for Environmental Education, which is legislatively mandated. We also have organizations such as Fish and Boat Commission, Game Commission, and we have members from higher ed and, the Department of Community and Economic Development. So it is a big team that all comes together. There are so many things that we can do, but I'm going to pass this off to Jessica, and then she'll pass it off to Judd, and then I'll come back and bring some pieces together.
All right, great. Thanks, Tammy. So for Pennsylvania Association of Environmental Educators, what we've seen is when that funding comes in from NOAA and those Kickstarters are able to empower organizations like us to offer these MIWI opportunities and to connect these non-formals and formal educators, that really helped PAEE move forward. We've always been connecting K-12 and non-formal educators. We've always been looking at a local effort, working with school districts, working with their local governments, working with their local nonprofits to perform most likely one and done programming where the students come out, they do something, it may be an action project, it may not be, and then they go back into their classrooms. With the funding from NOAA and our involvement in the ELIT capacity grant, we've been able to take that another step forward, working through the MIWI framework and showing non-formal and formal educators how to work at that local level through the MIWI framework makes so much more difference in what those students are learning. Taking that effort, taking the thought of climate resiliency and moving it forward with boots on the ground efforts locally. The students can see those changes in that local environment. They're not overwhelming changes or problems that they need to face. Climate change is so large that can be an issue, but allowing them to make that local change, see how to do that, working through their local governments, working through the nonprofits, and having educators in that K-12 environment that are already MIWI capable because of what the ELIT capacity grant program is doing in training the MIWI ambassadors across the state. So that's really where PAEE stands. We're in the middle, we're at that level 2, where we are reaching down, we're connecting to local programs and issues and getting everybody involved on that local effort. But then through the ELIT capacity grant and other efforts that Tammy's involved in is looking upwards and what can PAEE do to influence on that state level, because we are representing the non-formals of the state. We have a list of nearly 500 non-formal environmental education programs across the state that we can connect individual K-12s to. So they can go to our website, they can take a look at that list and say, oh, I didn't know this environmental center was just a half mile away or a mile away. I didn't know that these people offered programming that could enhance what we're doing and kind of fill in some of those gaps in content knowledge if need be. So we're making that connection. And I think that's very important moving forward to show that there is that support, that these K-12 educators are not doing this on their own. It's not something that the state is going to be saying, hey, you have to do this and we have no way of helping you. PAEE is there to help them connect to their local organizations, to give them extra professional development if they need be, or to connect them to places that can do that. And then we also act as that voice. So if we're on the ground, we're working with the teachers in the classrooms, and we see something that's needed, that's something that we can pass up the line and pass up to the state level and say, look, this is something that we're looking at. Is there funding out there like NOAA and the BWET grants that we can guide toward these educators so that they can become better prepared for teaching climate change and through the MIWI framework. So that's where PAEE stands. You know, we're here as that resource. We're here as that level 2 that can reach down, get people excited about what's going on in the local environment, get the students out on the ground, get their boots muddy, get their hands wet, and then take that knowledge and hopefully move it up the rung to the state level. And then speaking of the state level, that leads me into Judd Pittman and what he can do for us through his role with STEM.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Tamara and Shannon and Christy, for facilitating the conversation and opening up an opportunity for us to share. The graphic that Christy shared around sort of that network strategy and the weavers and the influencers, it made me think a lot about like how blessed we were in Pennsylvania for the conditions that were set as we came in to doing the work. So it took me back to the governor had established at the beginning of his administration 3 really broad goals. And they are government that works, schools that teach, and jobs that pay. And that government that works piece was really the charge for us as agencies to begin taking a networked approach with one another and making sure that we are communicating, we're sharing vision, we're sharing resources. And that really sparked a vision for STEM that former Secretary Rivera had charged us to move forward. And that was to make sure that we did take a networked approach, that we first hit the ground, we convened stakeholders, we listened. And as Christy had mentioned, we set a common language, a common vision around what STEM education was. And one of the things that she shared that really fit into the strategy that we tried to take was that we didn't get caught up in the acronyms. We wanted to make sure that it stuck with STEM as science, technology, engineering, and math. But in the common language that we developed that was influenced by roughly about 1,000 stakeholders, that those individuals that may see themselves as arts educators, non-formal environmental educators, those that may be passionate about computer science or other content areas could find their hook in that common vision and that common language and would want to be influencers and stakeholders and engage us as we continue to move forward. So we wanted to make sure first that we did have a broad enough vision or a language set that allowed folks to have a hook and to become part of that journey with us. And so that we did that in 2016, but that set the conditions for a lot of the future work, including collaborating on the BWET grant and growing state networks. So we're committed to that idea around bringing stakeholders closer to the center of policy and program making, as messy and sticky and arduous as that may be, that it's critical for us to listen and create policy and program that serves the learner. And that really is the common denominator, is that we want to bring all of those resources together to support the learner so that they can find their passion and their where the intermediate units, and only 2 of them felt comfortable delivering these kind of opportunities. They didn't have the content knowledge. And when we surveyed educators, they wanted to teach it, but they didn't quite have the comfort level. And then when we surveyed students and we talked to them, students want to just really do great work in this space because it's tangible. They feel like they can affect change. So what Jesse said about the connection between the informals and formals is critical for us to be able to operationalize environmental literacy across the state, because you are the content experts, you have the experience. And so the more that we weave those networks together, and we're trying to intentionally do that with the collaboration with PAEE and NOAA and our intermediate units and the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, so that each of those those STEM points of contact that'll be delivering the training have a buddy or a friend or an expert that they can lean on. And that's really the power that the state can play, is the convener and the relationship builder between partners, and make the conditions so that it can happen. And we've tried to do that with state funding streams. The last thing I would say is just the grant making opportunities. That is one thing that's in the sphere of influence of agencies. So we've tried to be better with the governor's PA Smart initiative to lend the language of environmental literacy into the grant making application, so that folks know that they can hook into and they can be part of that journey with us. And
Judd, thank you. Thank you.
I think I'm supposed to turn it back to Tammy. Sorry.
Thank you. So bouncing off of Jess and Judd here. So Judd didn't really focus on a project that he just really helped us get going. We needed more people who are familiar with the formal education world. And we just actually added approximately 29 educators from the STEM networks that are based at the intermediate units across the state of Pennsylvania. They're going to be partnering up with community members, with NGOs like the nonformal education realm, with Bureau of State Parks and the forestry teams, to help deliver more and more MIWI opportunities for the educators. But there's something else that came out. So when we transitioned from our first BWET grant to our second BWET grant for capacity building, we had identified that we were not working with a variety of populations that were in desperate need. So we weren't working with 21st century programs yet. We are now doing that. We weren't working with the migrant ed programs. We are now doing that. Not as much as I would like to, but we have started that pathway. We are working with agriculture education, and we're building strength even more between the careers connections for green careers and environmental based careers, and then also trying to build that understanding that every single career has a green connection to it. But we can't do this without a couple other pieces. And I don't know if they're as obvious to you as they are to me, and they will be as soon as I say it. So one, professional development. That doesn't just happen with teachers. It has to happen with administrators. It has to happen with facilities managers, or literally you are going to have action projects that are mowed over by the time they're done, or you won't have support for outdoor education programming. So that's something that we're trying to reach into. We actually have an Act 45, which is the administrator's course training that was approved. That's going to be launched at the end of this summer. You also need professional development in the pre-service realm. And we have some incredible people on this call right now. Nanette Dietrich, who's at Millersville, has really been helping push this with our ELIT capacity task force and our whole team. The other pieces that we need to keep in mind is that just like we have expectations for students' knowledge base when they're leaving high school, there are actually sets of guidance for teacher preparation and for graduate student or undergraduate students as they graduate from college. That all come into this discussion, and we are trying to build out and expand and make a voice to the teacher educators, as well as the college professors, university professors that are out there. We have to be delicate and thoughtful about how we do this, because it can't be a dictate. In Pennsylvania, we are a local control state. So we have to provide the support and structure for Green Ribbon Schools programs and pieces like that, and make it easy for everyone to do it. So our team is actively working on that. And Shannon, I don't know if you can see where I'm going with some of this, but we have a lot more work to do. But looking at this, we've come up with templates to help schools design their sustainable schools program. We've come up with some guidances, and actually our Pennsylvania facilitators guide for the MIWI, so that educators who are starting to try to get into this can have wonderful support and experience and resources at their fingertips. And all of this is able to happen because we have NOAA helping give us if there's a catalyst, they're the absolute catalyst. They gave us that last little piece of the equation that allows us to jump in and do what we need to do. So any questions or comments as we're looking? I think you can put things in the chat, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, you can put things in the chat. Thank you, Tammy and Jessica and Judd. So helpful to hear what's been going on in Pennsylvania, all the work that you've been able to do, and yet the vision for the work that still needs to happen is very useful to hear. And we invite all of you now, if you're comfortable, to turn your video on and just join in the conversation. Do you have any questions for Tammy, Jessica, Judd, or myself, or Shannon? We'd be happy to answer them. Do you care to share what's going on in your state and how it kind of mirrors what's happening in Pennsylvania or not? Yeah, we'd love to hear from you. And we also invite you to go to Padlet, also the Padlet, and think about these questions that we've posed for you for your breakouts. But yeah, for now, invite you to turn your video on and join in the discussion.
Yes, Randolph.
It's Randy Gusha with the Delaware Foundation for Science and Math Education. And by the way, I live on the Eastern Shore and I can throw stones at you guys. So I run this foundation where we look at this dynamic. I love these slides. I hope we get them all. But the one thing I didn't see in there is business. I didn't see, there isn't a large corporation who doesn't have sustainability and climate change as one of their 3 primary objectives in community outreach. And we in Delaware are trying to engage that religious belief into actionable connections. And that's why I loved your 3 stages and everything, but we're having trouble getting that connection between those businesses who say they want to do that and telling them what exactly they can do.
So
one of
go ahead, Jed.
I was just going to say, one of the things that we did do in Pennsylvania is try to think about what is that common denominator of language that speaks to them. And we found a lot of bipartisan traction when we spoke workforce development and economic development, and how sustainability is really about the triple bottom line. It's just not about being a steward to the earth. It really is. If that isn't your purview, it can be about the bottom line of your corporation, and trying to find that lexicon to work with. And with the STEM work, it really was about economic development. Like, we got folks to the table because we spoke jobs, and people were able to go back and say, we're talking jobs. And education was a bad word, but we were able to get there in that space. So I would challenge folks to think about what are those common denominators to go upon and really leverage it. Because sustainability for sustainability's sake might not be everybody's championship.
Yeah. And along those lines, in Pennsylvania, we're fortunate because we have some major industries that aren't considered manufacturing. We have the outdoor recreation industry. We have forestry. We are Pennsylvania. We have the agriculture community, which is a whole huge industry. And finding those common ground pieces and finding the concerns provides us a venue to open that door without, and allowing the people's emotions to stay neutral so that their neurons stay plastic, so that we can actually have a conversation without criticizing. So that's really, really important. The Advisory Council on EE and the PAEE team work with industry partners. And that's actually part of the MIWI framework, that you find community partners. So maybe not coming from the top down, but maybe from your local communities reaching out to find a partner to support a project. That might be the way to go, because we go from all different directions, but the strongest relationships are the ones that are connected at the local level and rise up.
Thank you. Anyone else with a question or something to share?
I had a quick question. This was in response to the discussion about adding pre-service teacher requirements. And I was kind of curious how you were working that through the like level 1 decision makers, how that was getting into the higher ed.
So that's the discussion that hasn't even started yet because we
Oh,
are.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood. Okay.
No, it's something that was identified as a need.
Okay.
However, in Pennsylvania, we have a STEM endorsement that is going on. We have some schools working on like an environmental literacy endorsement. And at present, we have a praxis for EE.
Oh.
So there are a couple different pieces that go in place. There are advisements from Association for Science Teacher Education in partnership with NSTA. They have a joint document that came out. I'm very involved with ASTE and have been doing research with them for a lot of years. So that's something that they're trying to push. PAE, or excuse me, NAAE, the North American Association for Environmental Education, has guidelines for teacher prep.
Yes.
Like all these things are across the board. And we're just trying to rise them up so people are aware of all these pieces right now.
Okay. I wasn't sure if you guys had been successful and had a model to follow yet. So
Well, I think that there is like an opportunity if you look at your state boards of education, and I'm not sure like what state you're from or how your state's organized, but like in Pennsylvania, you can either do standards adoption through an endorsement or a regulatory process. And
Right.
so one of the pathways that we found for computer science, which could be applied to another example, was if we get the state board to endorse the standards, which isn't a regulatory process, that ignites the post-secondary programs to have to redefine their teacher education pathways. And in this particular instance, we wanted to build a pathway. So even without the regulatory traditional methods, we were able to find a pathway to get teacher preparation programs to sort of redesign and reignite the process. I think you could look at that across any space, and you might not have to go through the arduous journey of a regulatory process to get to the ends that you want. There are some other regulatory levers that you could use.
great. Thank you.
So thank you. And let's take one more question. Frank has his hand up. Frank?
I'm loving this conversation. So I said another level up. You know, I'm looking at the state model, and so Sonia, I appreciate you putting it into so we can actually see this beyond now. But one of the questions I'm looking at is the cross-state action, because while state, I agree with your. Sorry, the assessment that state is really the center of the action work, but the inefficiencies of every state doing their own work in this, because there's a lot of commonalities, a lot of sharing, especially Judd, what you just said is a strategy that might work. This conversation here at the summit is, I imagine, where some of that cross-state work happens. But I'm wondering if in more network architectures are also necessary for cross-state work, but also connecting it more national organizations that have a work at the state and local level. So I'm just looking at is that part of the conversation, or is that kind of beyond the scope of the work as it's currently described?
So
Go ahead, Tammy.
Well, I was just going to say, that's where Shannon and Christy and this team come together. They are building the huge structural bridges that go back and forth. But go, Christy, go.
Well, I was just going to say, yeah, and it is essential that there is communication channels set up for the interstate conversation, because there is a lot of commonality. And we kind of, in the figure that Sonia shared, we call the work that you're doing at NOAA and the Chesapeake Bay program, we really see that as kind of the network catalyst. And you guys can play a super important role in convening conversations like this. And part of the work that I neglected to mention earlier is that in this model, there's an important feedback loop that comes back to what's happening in each state. We really want the network catalyst to stay connected so that they can help distribute some of these valuable lessons learned. But I couldn't agree with you more that these conversations are extremely important to have. And we see the network catalyst as providing that serving in that role of convening and making these conversations happen, or assisting them anyway. So we have 1 minute, and I thank you all so very much for being here. In the chat box is a link one more time to Padlet. Please go in, take a look at these questions. They're meant to kind of set the conversation, to help you begin thinking about how this work might influence, or lessons can be adapted for your state. It may influence the conversation that you have in your state breakouts later today. Thank you all for being here. And with that, I'll hand it back to Shannon to just, if you have any final closeouts.
No, I just thank you to our entire panel. I appreciate it. It's very important work. I think figuring out how to take things to scale is a huge conversation in the funders forums that I'm a part of, as well as in the federal government. And so kind of thinking through this model and how it can support that work, I think is so very important. So Christy and her team are doing, I mean, amazing work organizing kind of and understanding very quickly our structure. So thank you for your work, Christy. Thank you for your work, Pennsylvania team. And at any point, I'm happy to chat with anybody further about this.
Thank you all who make this real for us.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.